Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, the physical restraint of vulnerable mental health patients should be on the decline. 2 years ago, the government issued new guidance to try to tackle a culture of restraining people with mental health problems and learning difficulties after a series of scandals, most notoriously at Winterbourne View Care Home in South Gloucestershire. Yet this programme has learned that the number of restraints has actually gone up significantly. That's according to a Freedom of Information request by the former Health Minister who introduced the government guidelines. It also shows little change in the use of face-down restraint. NHS England insists progress is being made. Here's our social affairs correspondent, Alison Holt.
It happens in seconds.
Knees down.
Arms gripped, forced down, pinned to the ground. This is what face-down restraint looks like in a demonstration, and this is what it feels like.
There was someone pinning my back and someone holding my head and other people holding my arms and legs, and I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe.
This is Jane. That's not her real name, as she's asked us to disguise her identity and voice. Jane has bipolar disorder. In the past, she's also been sexually assaulted. The last time she was restrained face down on a mental health ward was 10 months ago. It involved about half a dozen staff. She was suicidal, and a male nurse was assigned to watch her every move.
I got very, very distressed that there was this male nurse watching me use the bathroom, use the toilet to shower. And I asked for a female nurse. I asked for him to go away. I tried to get past him. He physically stopped me getting past him. And then what happens is a restraint team arrives. These were large male nurses and the weight on my back was crushing my chest. It feels like you're being assaulted.
5 years ago, an investigation by the BBC's Panorama programme showed people with learning disabilities being goaded, then brutally restrained at the now closed Winterbourne View private hospital near Bristol. As a result, in April 2014, the government issued new guidance aimed at reducing physical restraint. It says staff mustn't deliberately restrain people in a way that could have an impact on their breathing, such as face-down restraint. But Jane was restrained after that was introduced, and a Freedom of Information request underlines how little has changed. Just before the new guidance was introduced, just over 57,000 restraints were recorded. But 2 years on, there were nearly 67,000. Better reporting may explain some of that significant rise, but nearly 19% of those restraints were face down. The information was collected by Norman Lamb, the former Health Minister who introduced the guidance.
I found it extraordinarily depressing, and I started to sort of think about explanations, and I think part of the explanation is that most mental health units around the country are operating on 100% capacity, if not even more. So they're operating under enormous strain, often with staff shortages, with the use of agency staff. So this becomes containment, control, rather than therapeutic recovery. And so we're letting down some of the most vulnerable people in our country in the most dreadful way.
The man in the middle being restrained in this demonstration is Professor Tim Kendall. His health trust in Sheffield has managed to end the use of face-down restraint and reduce physical restraint overall.
Pretty unpleasant, actually. Hard to breathe.
Professor Kendall is also NHS England's new Clinical Director for Mental Health. He says they are making progress, but the use of restraint varies a lot between mental health trusts.
I think restraint is an incredibly important index of how well we are humanising and ethicizing and professionalising the way we look after people on inpatient units in particular. So for those trusts where they're not changing things in a positive way, or worse still, things are becoming more negative, they really need to take note of this. These are real human rights and ethical issues that they should be thinking about. But for those trusts where they're coming back at zero face-down restraint, for example, my own trust, or Nottingham, clearly have no face-down restraints at all, it can be done. So others take note.
Others should also take note of Jane, who believes the biggest single impact of being restrained was she stopped talking to the people she'd hoped would help her.
You don't tell nursing staff or psychiatrists how you're actually feeling, because your main objective is to get out of there as soon as you can, and you'll do whatever it takes to get out of there. So that includes being discharged when you're still suicidal, because you're not going to tell them you're still suicidal, because the risk of being restrained in that way is very real. And if they can do it to me, who's somebody with no history of violence or aggression or resistance at all, who rarely raises my voice in that sort of situation, who's quiet and withdrawn, then they can do it with anyone.
Well, we can talk now to Norman Lamb MP. He was in our film there, campaigned for that change in government guidelines on restraining mental health patients. The guidelines came in 2 years ago. Paul Farmer from the mental health charity Mind. Their initial research prompted Norman Lamb to raise it as an issue in the first place. And Sarah, not her real name, was sectioned and says she was restrained face down 6 times in a mental health hospital. She wants to remain anonymous because of what she sees as the shame of being restrained. Thank you all for joining us. Sarah, our report gave a pretty good impression of how it must feel to be restrained. It's happened to you 6 times, so tell us how you felt when it was happening to you.
I felt like I was being ambushed by kidnappers, I suppose. It was completely out of the blue. It was completely extraordinary. I've never experienced anything like it before or since. One thing I think that the VT didn't show was that it's 6 people. There's 6 people who turn up, one for each limb, one for the head, and one to monitor overall, and they're all talking to each other. They're manoeuvring, they're chatting to each other, they're laughing, they're coordinating. They would turn up out of the blue with their blue latex gloves. One of them would run at me. They all sort of move at the same time. I'd be manoeuvred face down onto my bed. I would be, one person would be kneeling on each leg, and that would press into the metal at the end of the bed. One person holding each arm down, one person for the head, one person over the top, and then they would yank down my trousers on one side and pull down my underwear. There'd be an antiseptic swab, and they'd stick a needle in, then they would do the same on the other side, pull down my trousers, pull down my other side, jab me with a needle, and then at a signal they would all let go as one, and then they'd be clambering off the bed and going, and I'd just be lying there face down in dirty sheets with my bed pulled out from the wall, and I would have just been in my bed space minding my own business. So it's horrifying, it's terrifying, and I think anyone who was in a who was feeling pretty happy and chirpy and strong would be shocked by that. But for me, I was very vulnerable. I suppose I'd sort of collapsed mentally, and I'd gone in there for help and refuge and asylum, and instead what I got was absolutely brutalised in the most toxic way possible. And I never knew they were going to turn up. It would be again and again and again out of the blue. Just to administer medication. There was never anyone who warned me, never anyone spoke to me, never once did someone say that we think this is what's wrong with you, these are some medication options, what do you think? Not once was I offered medication in advance. I would look up, and there they would be. One time I was in a meeting with my independent mental health advocate. She asked me to go and get a letter. I went to my bed space, I was looking through my paperwork, I heard a noise, I turned round, and there they were, mob-handed, and they did that same thing to me again. And you're flipped upside down, all dignity and humanity stripped, treated like an animal, and it forces you to places where you'd never go before. I'd never shown any aggression or violence or resistance. I'm a quiet, middle-aged, middle-class woman. It was just horrifying.
Norman, that happened to Sarah in 2011, repeatedly over the course of that year. Because of cases like that 2 years ago, you introduced guidelines to stop that sort of restraint. Have they just been completely ignored?
Well, in too many places, that's what it feels like. I mean, it was this man who started it all off. He did a survey which showed the extent of the use of restraint. I was horrified by what I saw as minister. So I brought people into the department, including people who had suffered restraint. And it's harrowing to hear these stories. And this is in the hands of the state. This is people who go into the care of the state and are suffering abuse and assault, effectively. And of course, there'll be many people in those settings who suffered abuse at some stage in their life. And so for them being assaulted in this way, that's how it feels like, is a real trauma, which can lead to post-traumatic stress and so forth. So I think this is a massive moral, human rights issue. And here's the thing, we know from progressive practitioners like Tim Kendall, who thankfully, as National Clinical Director, hopefully can drive change, but they've shown it's possible. He's ended face-down restraint, significantly reduced other restraint. So there is no excuse, really, not to treat this as a top priority, because if you lose the trust of the people that are caring for you, you can't have therapeutic recovery. It's impossible. It's just force and containment.
Paul, listening to Sarah here with us and Jane in our report, it seems that what happened to them came out of the blue. You would imagine if any restraint is going to be happening in any environment, it's in response to somebody who's behaving in a way that the people looking after them feel that they can't handle it. What's your explanation for the sort of cases that we're hearing and why the restraint is used?
Well, it's hard to come up with any possible human explanation for why this should take place, isn't it? And as you've already heard from Sarah, this is when restraint is being used on people who are not threatening or violent towards staff in any way, shape or form, then you have to ask the question about what's the culture in a particular ward. So,
and is that common?
Well, I think what the really helpful information tells us today, and we've just started to look at it and understand it, is that it's far too common in far too many places, but it's also very erratic. So there's clearly some parts of the country where trusts have really taken the new guidelines on board, taken it very seriously, and you're seeing significant reductions. And then other parts of the country where there's either very, very little change or indeed increase in use of restraint. And I think what we need to do now is really understand what's going on in those particular trusts, to understand why restraint is in some cases being used more. It might be because people are reporting better, but we want to understand to what extent some of the cultural issues are being addressed, because this is, we are talking about people who are often at their most vulnerable. You only really go into a mental health hospital now when you're really ill. So you're very, very vulnerable, and it's so important that people are treated humanely and in a dignified way.
There's also actually an impact on staff who often haven't been trained adequately. There's no accreditation of training, which is a massive issue, so we don't know the quality of much of the training that goes on, and a lot of staff end up injured at work. And what places have found where they've actually transformed the culture is that they end up with massive reductions in sickness absence of staff because they are safer. So, in everyone's interest, this has to change.
Sarah, you wanted to come in there.
I think I was just vigorously agreeing with everything that people were saying about that. I think it creates a toxic work culture because the people who were the 6 people who would come in and do the restraint on me, 3 of them were rapid response squad who sort of used to lurk in the corridors waiting to be called. But the 3 other staff would be occupational therapists and nurses who were working on the ward in any case, and there was no. They were just talking to each other, so it was very much a them and us. There was no possibility of developing therapeutic relationships.
Norman, if this has been so entrenched in the system, is something stronger than guidance needed?
Yes.
Well, I think it needs to become what they call in the health service a never event, something that should never happen.
But how do you make that happen? I mean, the guidance came in 2 years ago, the numbers have gone up. Did it need something then stronger? Does it need something stronger now? A change in the law?
I think what we've seen in terms of the response to the guidance, it's clearly not enough. So there needs to be a much firmer direction given nationally that this is something that can't be tolerated.
And how do you do that, though?
I understand that we're sometimes dealing with some highly complex individuals who are going through their own real anxieties, but we have to understand that if you can take action to avoid the situations developing where people become anxious and stressed. I mean, this was, in Sarah's case, it was to apply medication, but often it's when someone gets acutely distressed and anxious and then they come in to restrain them. There are clear strategies that can be used to avoid these situations happening in the first place. And so there's an absolute imperative to do the training. The training programme...
But does a message need to go out, first of all, Paul, that it just will not be tolerated in any scenario? It's not just guidance. There are actually ways that it will be enforced that it doesn't happen.
I think there are three things that need to happen. First of all, we shouldn't have to rely on freedom of information requests to see this information. I think this should be routinely reported transparently, publicly by every trust. Secondly, I think there needs to be a very strong message that use of face-down restraint in particular really shouldn't be tolerated.
And some people have lost their lives as a result of face-down restraint.
And indeed. And thirdly, I think this, as Tim Kendall said on your piece, this is a litmus test for the way in which we are treating people with mental health problems. And I think as we see an increasing level of, concern, public concern about the way in which we think about mental health as an issue, this is one of those indicators we need to keep a really close eye on.
Sarah, you obviously went into hospital for treatment because you were in a desperate place.
Yes.
You needed help.
Yes.
This happened to you over the course of being in hospital for a year. When you came out...
I was in hospital for a year. This is over the course of a few weeks.
Oh, OK. But over the course of the year, in that period in 2011, it happened 6 times. When you ended the treatment, did you feel that you were in a better place than you'd been previously?
No, I was in a much worse place. I'd gone in there poorly and extremely vulnerable, and I came out far worse. I came out with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is what soldiers get on the battlefield, and that's persisted, and it's had had I received good care and treatment, I would have been back in work in a few weeks or months. As it is, 5 years later, the post-traumatic stress disorder has, I suppose, terrorised and brutalised my life, and I'm just a changed person, and I'm just further away from the jobs market than ever. The short-term ward management measure that staff used to get their way, rather than using persuasion and working with me and building therapeutic relationships, that's had a lasting impact. I think that's a real message.
And how disastrous is that at the hands of the state?
Yes.
Have you had good treatment since?
No.
Why?
No, I think my combination, I would describe it as my treatment I describe as a combination of brutalisation followed by neglect. It's been taken...
Have you sought treatment, or have you been fearful because of what happened to you?
No, I even have a letter from Norman Lamb after my MP appealed to him to try and when he was minister in government to try and get treatment, because I was sort of pushed around from pillar to post, from assessment to assessment. There are so many gaps in the mental health system. I've only just now started treatment for the post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's 5 years later. But in the preceding 5 years, I think basically I've been sort of deemed a success case because I've been stable on medication and welfare benefits. But that's just been a half-life. There's been no attempt to try to help me get back on my feet. I just have been trying every which way, to the extent of going to see my counsellors, going to see my MP, and my MP wrote to, and I got a letter from Norman Lamb. Every which way that I could.
We need to do so much better, and we know the evidence is there that we can do better. This is the outrageous thing.
Yes.
But people suffering mental ill health experience discrimination. They don't get the same access to treatment as other people do, and it's the way money is allocated across the system. They don't have the same right to get treatment on a timely basis, and so often the inpatient facilities are full to overflowing, under enormous pressure. This is still a neglected area, and there is a moral imperative as well as an enormous economic
and this
case
is obviously
to change.
something you have been talking about for some time. So lots of people getting in touch on this, as they always do when we talk about these issues. Nigel on Facebook: physical restraint is sometimes necessary as a last resort with individuals who are being aggressive towards others and are liable to cause injury to themselves or others and cannot be de-escalated by non-physical means. Jay on Facebook: problem is no one cares for people who are unwell in the head. We get the worst deal, really. They close all of the outpatients and you can't get a CPN,
community psychiatric nurse,
community psychiatric nurse or anything. Eventually you end up so bad that A&E can't handle you, so they use restraints. Keely on Facebook: I think people need to realise that it's taught to be used as a last resort and actually saves some people's lives. For example, people who are determined to kill themselves. or others.
And that's the complexity, because sometimes if someone's about to take their own life or to cause damage to somebody else, intervention is necessary, but in so many cases it's not necessary.
In so many cases I think it's used as a first resort, and that's the problem.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. And Paul and Norman, thank you for coming in. And do let us know your thoughts on that as well.
I've been